The employment contract that Marcus received in his email at 11:47 p.m. on a Wednesday in November was accompanied by a note that explained with unusual specificity that the position of night shift facilities manager at Westfield Academy was available immediately and that the salary was substantially higher than the market rate for similar positions. Marcus Chen, 48 years old, had been unemployed for approximately 3 months at that point, a period of time that had coincided with the dissolution of a consulting business that had consumed 12 years of his professional life. The business had failed not because of market conditions or poor planning, but because Marcus had discovered, sometime in the 8th year of operation, that he no longer wanted to spend his days advising corporate clients on efficiency optimization and cost reduction strategies. He had continued to work for 4 more years out of inertia and financial obligation, but the work had become increasingly divorced from anything resembling genuine engagement or interest. When the business finally collapsed, not dramatically but through a slow erosion of clients and revenue, Marcus had experienced not distress but a kind of relief so profound that it frightened him. Relief suggested that something he had been doing for a very long time had been fundamentally wrong, and the implications of that realization extended far beyond the business itself into the larger structure of how he had chosen to live his life. The email from Westfield Academy had arrived during one of Marcus's frequent 3 a.m. insomnia episodes, the kind of wakefulness that had become his default state since the business had closed. He read the employment contract 3 times, searching for hidden conditions or unusual stipulations that would explain why the salary was 30% higher than comparable positions. The contract was surprisingly straightforward. The position involved managing the facilities of Westfield Academy, a private school located in a prosperous suburb of Portland, Oregon. The work would include janitorial duties, maintenance coordination, landscape management, and security monitoring. The position required the employee to work between 7 p.m. and 6 a.m., 6 days per week, with Sundays off. The salary was $62,000 annually, plus health benefits, plus a housing allowance that would provide for a modest apartment within walking distance of the campus. What the contract did not explain was why the position paid substantially more than similar positions at comparable institutions. What it did not explain was why the previous night shift manager had departed after only 4 months of employment, or why the position had remained unfilled for approximately 8 weeks before Marcus's application had presumably been selected from a pool of candidates. Marcus had applied to the position on a whim, submitting his resume and a brief cover letter that was honest about his lack of direct experience in facilities management, but that emphasized his organizational skills and his comfort with working independently. He had not expected to hear back. The fact that he had been selected and offered the position within 24 hours suggested either that the applicant pool had been extremely limited, or that something about his application had resonated with the hiring team in a way that transcended the normal criteria used to evaluate candidates. He had decided at 3:47 a.m. to accept the offer. Westfield Academy occupied a sprawling campus in the hills west of Portland, a property that had once been a private estate and that had been converted into a school facility approximately 30 years earlier. The main building was a 3-story Victorian structure that had been extensively renovated to accommodate administrative offices and classroom space. Surrounding the main building were several smaller structures, a library building, a gymnasium, a dining hall, and a series of dormitory buildings for the school's boarding students. The entire campus was surrounded by wooded grounds that extended for approximately 40 acres, creating a sense of isolation and separation from the surrounding suburban development. Marcus arrived at the campus for his first day of employment on a Monday evening in late November. The weather was cold and damp, the kind of Oregon winter weather that suggested the possibility of rain without actually delivering it. The sky was a uniform gray, and the light was beginning to fade from the landscape as afternoon transitioned into evening. The campus, viewed under these conditions, had a quality that was difficult to describe, but that Marcus found himself cataloging with unusual attention. The buildings seemed to recede into themselves, the wooded grounds seemed to deepen, and the overall impression was of a space that was designed for daytime occupancy, but that transformed into something substantially different once darkness fell.
He was met at the main office by a woman named Patricia, the school's administrative director, who was in her early 60s, and who had the bearing of someone who had been managing institutions long enough to have developed strong opinions about how institutions should be managed. She provided him with a set of keys, a radio, and a written document that was titled Night Shift Facilities Management, Operational Protocols and Guidelines. The previous manager, Robert, worked here for 4 months, Patricia said, handing him the document. He was competent, organized, and thorough, but he became uncomfortable with some aspects of the position and chose to resign. What aspects? Marcus asked. The rules, Patricia said. There are specific protocols that need to be followed during the night shift. Most of them are straightforward and related to security and facility management, but some of them are less conventional, and I suspect Robert had difficulty accepting their rationale. She didn't elaborate further, instead directing Marcus to review the document and to contact her if he had questions. She left him alone in the administrative office at approximately 5:15 p.m., with the understanding that he would begin his shift at 7 p.m. Marcus sat alone in the quiet office and opened the document. The document was organized into 2 sections. The first section contained standard operational protocols, procedures for locking and unlocking buildings, schedules for various maintenance tasks, emergency contact information, and guidelines for responding to security incidents. This section was approximately 8 pages long and contained nothing that was unusual or notable. The second section was titled Special Protocols, Night Hours Operations, 7 p.m. to 6 a.m., and consisted of 17 distinct rules. The first 10 rules were conventional: maintain security perimeter checks, ensure all buildings are locked at specific times, monitor security camera feeds, respond to emergency calls, document any unusual incidents. These rules were similar to what Marcus would have expected from any facilities management position at a residential institution. Rules 11 through 15 began to introduce elements that were more unusual. Rule 11 specified that certain areas of the campus were to be avoided during specific hours. Specifically, the rule stated that the library building and the gymnasium should not be entered between the hours of 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. Rule 12 specified that the dormitory building should be monitored from the exterior only. Night shift staff should not enter the dormitories under any circumstances, regardless of circumstances. Rule 13 specified that the wooded grounds surrounding the campus should not be entered after dark under any circumstances. Rules 16 and 17 were expressed in language that was notably vague and that suggested a level of caution that went significantly beyond standard facility management protocol. Rule 16 stated, "Do not investigate unusual sounds or disturbances originating from the eastern section of campus after 11 p.m. If unusual sounds or disturbances are reported, document them and contact the on-call administrator. Do not attempt to identify or locate the source of such disturbances independently." Rule 17, the final rule, was the most cryptic and the most unsettling. It stated, "The campus is not entirely vacant during night hours. Maintain awareness of this fact, but do not attempt to make contact with or investigate the presence of any individuals not identified as authorized personnel. If you encounter any individuals on campus during night hours, retreat to the main office and contact the on-call administrator." Marcus read this document 3 times, and with each reading, his understanding of what he had agreed to shifted. He was not being hired to perform routine janitorial and maintenance work. He was being hired to manage a campus that apparently operated under a set of constraints that suggested the presence of something, some activity, some phenomenon, some aspect of the campus's operation, that could not be explained or acknowledged directly, and that required careful management to prevent incident or discovery. He considered briefly whether he should decline the position and withdraw from the commitment he had made. But as he sat alone in the quiet office, contemplating the decision, he realized that he was genuinely curious. For the first time in months, perhaps longer, he was experiencing a state of mind that resembled engagement, a kind of focused attention that transcended the automatic patterns that had characterized most of his professional life. The rules were cryptic and unsettling, but they were also intriguing.
and Marcus, at 48 years old, was tired of living a life that was predictable and safe and fundamentally disconnected from anything resembling genuine mystery. He decided to accept the position. He would follow the rules precisely, perform the work conscientiously, and attempt to understand, through careful observation and deduction, what the rules were designed to protect or conceal. His first night shift was unremarkable in every observable way. He arrived at 6:45 p.m., reviewed the facility with the day staff manager, and took over at 7 p.m. The campus was empty of students and faculty, as it was in the early stages of winter break. His primary responsibilities for the first week would involve security monitoring, ensuring that buildings were locked, and performing basic maintenance tasks. He was instructed to avoid any major maintenance work during the first month, instead focusing on learning the facility and establishing the routines that would characterize his position. Marcus spent his first shift walking the campus and familiarizing himself with its layout. He visited each building, confirmed that they were locked, and reviewed the security camera feeds. The campus was quiet, illuminated by a network of pathway lights that created a kind of artificial twilight throughout the grounds. He felt as he walked the sense of being observed, though he could identify no obvious source for this sensation. It was a feeling that was often described as the presence of someone watching you, though Marcus had always found that description to be imprecise. What he was experiencing was something more subtle. The sense that the space itself was aware of his presence, that his movement through the campus was being noted and evaluated by some aspect of the environment that transcended the merely physical. By midnight, he had completed his initial security checks and returned to the main office. He sat at the desk and monitored the security camera feeds, watching the various pathways and building entrances for any sign of activity. There was nothing. The campus remained silent and empty. At 1 a.m., as he was reviewing the security logs from the previous evening, he heard a sound. It was distant, originating from somewhere on the campus, but it was clearly audible through the building's open windows. The sound was difficult to categorize. It was neither quite human nor quite animal, a kind of vocalizing that seemed to occupy an uncertain space between these categories. It lasted for approximately 5 seconds, and then it ceased. Marcus stood and went to the window, attempting to determine the origin of the sound. But the darkness beyond the office building was nearly complete, the pathway lights providing only minimal illumination. He could see perhaps 30 feet in any direction, beyond which the landscape dissolved into shadow. He considered following Rule 16, which instructed him to document unusual sounds and contact the on-call administrator. But it was 1 a.m., and contacting someone at this hour seemed premature, especially based on a single vague sound that might have had any number of mundane explanations. Instead, he documented the incident in the night log. 1 a.m. Unidentified sound from campus. Origin unclear. Duration approximately 5 seconds. No follow-up investigation performed. The rest of his first shift proceeded without incident. At 6 a.m., he locked the main office and walked to the parking lot, where he had parked his car. As he drove away from the campus, he found himself thinking about the sound he had heard, and about Rule 17, which specified that the campus was not entirely vacant during night hours, and that he should not attempt to make contact with or investigate any individuals on campus. Over the following 2 weeks, Marcus established a routine. He would arrive at the campus at 6:45 p.m., conduct an initial security sweep of all buildings, and spend the remainder of his shift performing routine maintenance work or monitoring the security systems. The work was straightforward and not particularly demanding. Most nights he was alone on the campus, moving between buildings and performing tasks that required minimal cognitive engagement. But the campus was not entirely vacant. This fact became increasingly evident as he spent more time on the grounds during night hours. There were signs of activity that were subtle but consistent. Doors that had been opened and reclosed, pathways that showed recent foot traffic, items that had been moved from their previous positions, and there were sounds irregular and difficult to characterize that originated from various locations on the campus at unpredictable times.
Following Rule 16, Marcus documented all of these observations but did not investigate. He noted the times and locations of sounds, the evidence of movement, the signs of activity, and he noticed a pattern. Most of the activity occurred in the eastern section of the campus, in and around the dormitory buildings, and most of the activity occurred between the hours of 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., the same hours during which Rule 11 specified that the library building and gymnasium should not be entered. On the 15th night of his employment, as he was walking past the dormitory buildings at approximately 11:30 p.m., he saw a figure. It was moving in the darkness between two of the dormitory structures, a human-shaped form that was clearly visible in silhouette against the distant pathway lighting. The figure appeared to be moving deliberately, following some kind of path or trajectory that suggested intention and purpose. Marcus stopped walking and watched as the figure disappeared behind one of the dormitory buildings. He documented the observation in his night log. 11:30 p.m. Visual observation of individual on campus, eastern section near dormitory buildings, individual not identified as authorized personnel. No follow-up investigation performed, per Rule 17. He did not contact the on-call administrator. He did not attempt to follow or identify the individual. He simply noted what he had observed and continued with his patrol of the campus. Over the following week, he observed additional figures on campus during night hours. They were always visible only in glimpses, always moving with deliberate purpose, always disappearing into shadows or between buildings before Marcus could get a clear view of their appearance or identity, and he understood, with increasing certainty, that Rule 17 was not designed to prevent Marcus from investigating unauthorized individuals. It was designed to prevent Marcus from making contact with individuals who were authorized to be on the campus, but whose presence was not supposed to be acknowledged or questioned. By his 4th week of employment, Marcus had developed several hypotheses about what the night shift rules were designed to conceal. The most plausible hypothesis was that the school was conducting some kind of research or experimental program that required the presence of individuals on campus during night hours, individuals whose presence was to be kept confidential. The rules were designed to ensure that Marcus remained aware of the campus's activities without actually being able to identify or report on those activities. He was employed as a kind of willing observer, someone who would maintain the security and functioning of the campus while deliberately remaining ignorant of what was actually occurring within that space. This hypothesis was not entirely comfortable, but it was rational. It suggested that the school's administration had made specific choices about how to manage certain activities, and that Marcus had been hired to participate in that management through a specific role, performing essential functions while deliberately refraining from investigating or reporting on the less conventional aspects of the campus's operation. On a Wednesday night in early December during his 33rd shift, Marcus discovered something that challenged this hypothesis. He was performing routine maintenance in the basement of the main building, replacing filters in the HVAC system, when he noticed an additional door located behind a stack of stored equipment. The door was small, perhaps 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide, and it was constructed of metal rather than the wood that characterized the other doors in the basement. The door had a padlock, but the padlock was not engaged. It was hanging open on its hinges. Marcus moved the equipment that was blocking access to the door and examined it more carefully. The door appeared to be old, but it had been maintained. The hinges were well oiled and the frame was in good condition. And on the side of the door, someone had written, in what appeared to be permanent marker, a single word: archive. Marcus looked at the padlock, and then he looked around the basement to confirm that he was alone. The basement was silent except for the sound of the HVAC system's constant operation. There were no security cameras in the basement. He had confirmed this on his first day of employment. He understood that opening the door would constitute a violation of the spirit, if not the letter, of the protocols he had been given. The rules did not explicitly forbid him from exploring the basement or from opening doors that he encountered, but the rules were designed to establish boundaries around investigation and inquiry, and crossing those boundaries felt significant. He opened the door. Behind the door was a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. The stairs appeared to be old, and they were made of metal, creating a kind of industrial aesthetic that was inconsistent with the Victorian architecture that characterized the rest of the campus. Marcus could see perhaps 8 steps before the darkness became complete. He returned to his maintenance work, but his mind was occupied by the discovery of the stairs. He finished replacing the HVAC filters and cleaned up his equipment, and then he returned to the small metal door. The question that was occupying his mind was not whether he should investigate the stairs, but rather whether he had the right to remain ignorant of what lay beyond them. The entire structure of his employment had been built around the deliberate preservation of ignorance, around maintaining awareness of activity without allowing that awareness to develop into actual knowledge. But the stairs suggested an additional layer, a hidden space within the campus that even the rules had not explicitly addressed. He descended the stairs. At the bottom of the stairs, there was a corridor. It was lit by a series of fluorescent lights that had been installed, incongruously, alongside what appeared to be much older structural elements. The corridor was perhaps 20 feet long, and it terminated in a large metal door that appeared to be locked. To the right of the corridor, there was a smaller doorway, and beyond that doorway was a space that was illuminated by ambient light. Marcus entered that space. It was a room. It was approximately 15 feet by 20 feet, and its walls were lined with filing cabinets and bookshelves. The filing cabinets were labeled with dates and names. The bookshelves contained what appeared to be bound records or journals, each one labeled with a year or a date range. Marcus approached one of the filing cabinets and examined the labels. The oldest label read 1987 to 1991. The most recent label read 2018 to 2022. Between these extremes were approximately 30 additional labels, each one corresponding to a specific time period. He opened one of the filing cabinets at random, selecting the drawer labeled 2001 to 2005. Inside the drawer were hundreds of individual files, each one marked with a name and a date. He selected a file at random and opened it. The file contained written observations. The handwriting suggested that the observations had been recorded over a period of time, with entries dated across a span of several months. The entries were brief and clinical, describing observations of an individual identified only as Subject 7. The observations cataloged the subject's behavior, physical appearance, preferences, and reactions to various stimuli. The observations were detailed and systematic, the kind of observations that would be conducted during the course of a scientific study or psychological experiment. Marcus closed the file and replaced it in the cabinet. He looked around the room with a new understanding of what he was witnessing. This was not simply a hidden space within the school. This was an archive of data, a systematic record of observations that had been conducted over a period of approximately 35 years. The obvious conclusion was that Westfield Academy was not a conventional school, or rather it was a school, but it was also something else. It was a location where long-term, systematic observations of individuals had been conducted, and those observations had been carefully documented and preserved. Marcus did not open any additional files. He did not explore the locked metal door at the end of the corridor. He simply stood in the archive for several minutes, processing what he had discovered, and then he returned to the stairs and climbed back to the basement. He finished his shift in a state of distracted awareness, moving through the required tasks mechanically, while his mind occupied itself with questions about what he had discovered and what it meant about the institution he had agreed to work for. At 6 a.m., he left the campus. For the next 2 days, Marcus did not report for his shift. Instead, he sat in his apartment in Portland, attempting to process what he had discovered and determining what he should do with that knowledge. He considered several options. He could report what he had found to the school's administration and inquire about the purpose of the archive. He could report the archive to local law enforcement or to some kind of regulatory authority. He could resign and walk away from the situation entirely, accepting that he had encountered something beyond his ability to address or resolve. None of these options were satisfactory. Reporting to the school's administration seemed naive. Clearly, the administration was aware of the archive and had designed the night shift protocol specifically to prevent facilities managers from discovering it. The fact that the archive existed suggested that whatever was being conducted at Westfield Academy was sufficiently unconventional or potentially legally questionable that it required deliberate concealment. Reporting to law enforcement seemed equally problematic. He had no concrete evidence of any illegal activity, only the existence of an archive of observations. And walking away felt like a betrayal of something, though he couldn't articulate precisely what he was betraying. On his third day away from the campus, Marcus made a decision. He would return to work, and he would attempt to understand the archive more thoroughly. He would review the files. He would attempt to determine what kind of observations were being conducted, and he would assess whether the activity represented genuine harm or whether it was something that, while unconventional, was not inherently damaging. When he returned to the campus on his fourth day away, he was met by Patricia in the administrative office. "You've been absent," she said. Her tone was not accusatory, but it conveyed the clear implication that his absence had not gone unnoticed. "I had some personal matters to attend to," Marcus said. "I apologize for not providing advance notice." Patricia nodded slowly, and she studied him with an expression that suggested she was evaluating something more than his explanation for his absence. "Marcus," she said, "I need to ask you directly. Have you discovered anything on the campus that has concerned you? Anything that made you question the nature of the institution or the purpose of your employment?" Marcus considered lying. He considered maintaining the pretense of ignorance that had characterized most of his employment to that point. But looking at Patricia's expression, he understood that she already knew the answer to her question. She was not asking because she was uncertain. She was asking because she wanted to know what Marcus had discovered and how he intended to respond to that discovery. "I found a room," Marcus said, "in the basement of the main building. It contains files and records documenting observations of individuals over a period of approximately 35 years. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was quieter than it had been before. "The previous night shift manager found that room as well," she said. "He felt, as you presumably feel now, that he had been placed in an untenable position, aware of something that he believed should not be concealed, but lacking any clear mechanism for addressing that awareness." "What is happening here?" Marcus asked. "What kind of observations are being conducted?" "Come with me," Patricia said. She stood and walked toward the door, gesturing for Marcus to follow. They left the administrative office and walked across the campus in the early evening light. Patricia led him to one of the dormitory buildings, and she used a key to unlock the main entrance. Inside, the dormitory was designed like a conventional residential space with common areas, hallways lined with doors, and standard furnishings. Patricia led him down one of the hallways to a specific door, and she knocked. A young man answered. He was perhaps 20 years old, with an appearance that suggested mixed Asian and European ancestry. He greeted Patricia with a kind of casual familiarity that suggested a prior relationship. "David, this is Marcus," Patricia said. "Marcus is the new night shift manager. David is one of our residential students." "Welcome to Westfield," David said, extending his hand. Marcus shook it, noting the firmness of the grip and the directness of the eye contact. "David has agreed to explain some of what happens here," Patricia said. "I think it will be helpful for you to hear his perspective." They sat in David's dormitory room, which was equipped with a desk, a bed, shelves filled with books, and a window that looked out onto the campus grounds. David offered them beverages, and when they declined, he settled into a chair across from Marcus and began to speak. "Westfield Academy is a research institution," David said. "It has existed for approximately 40 years, and its purpose is to conduct long-term longitudinal studies of human development, psychology, and behavior. The subjects of these studies are individuals who have volunteered to participate in exchange for financial compensation and educational opportunities." "Volunteered," Marcus repeated. "Yes," David said. "I am a voluntary research subject. I came to Westfield when I was 15 years old after my parents read about the program and made contact with the institution. I have been here for 5 years, and I have chosen to extend my participation for an additional 2 years. I am compensated significantly for my time, and I have access to educational resources and opportunities that I would not otherwise have. In exchange, I allow the researchers to observe my behavior, conduct psychological evaluations, and record data related to my development. What is the purpose of this research? Marcus asked. The purpose is to understand how human beings develop over time, David said. How our personalities form, how our values develop, how we respond to various stimuli and circumstances. The research is longitudinal, meaning that it tracks individuals over extended periods, typically 5 to 10 years, and examines how their development unfolds across that time span. And the observations are recorded, Marcus said. There's an archive of files documenting the observations. Yes, Patricia said. The data is meticulously recorded and preserved. It's invaluable from a research perspective. The kind of longitudinal data that we've accumulated is not available from any other source. It provides insights into human development that would be impossible to obtain through any other methodology. But there are ethical concerns, Marcus said. It was not a question. There are always ethical concerns with any research involving human subjects, Patricia said. But we address those concerns through rigorous protocols. Every subject is informed of the nature of the research and the extent of the observation. Every subject has the right to withdraw at any time. The data is protected and used only for approved research purposes, and the benefits to the research subjects are substantial: financial compensation, educational access, and the knowledge that they are contributing to a body of research that will advance human understanding. Marcus looked at David, attempting to determine whether his expression reflected genuine consent or something more complicated, perhaps resignation, or acceptance of a situation that he had agreed to, but that he did not find entirely comfortable. Why am I being told this? Marcus asked. If the institution is conducting legitimate research with proper protocols and voluntary subjects, why the need for all the rules and the deliberate concealment? Because society is not prepared to understand this kind of research, Patricia said. Because there are people who would react to it with fear and suspicion, regardless of its ethical framework. Because there are regulatory agencies and media outlets and advocacy organizations that would immediately assume the worst about what we're doing, without taking the time to understand the actual protocols and the voluntary nature of the participation. The rules exist not to conceal wrongdoing, but to maintain the privacy and safety of the subjects and to prevent external interference with legitimate research. Marcus stood and walked to the window. He looked out onto the campus, which was beginning to transition from daylight into the early stages of evening darkness. The campus that he had experienced as ominous and unsettling now seemed merely to be a place where a specific kind of work was being conducted. Work that was perhaps unconventional, but that was not inherently sinister. What happened to Robert? Marcus asked, referring to the previous night shift manager, the one who discovered the archive and then resigned. Robert came to the same conclusion that you appear to be approaching, Patricia said. He understood that the research was legitimate and that the protocols were sound, but he was unable to accept the tension between understanding that the research was legitimate and feeling uncomfortable about being part of an institution that conducted observations of human subjects without their knowledge during night hours. He resigned because he could not reconcile those two things. Marcus turned back from the window and looked at Patricia. Are the night shift observations part of the formal research protocol? He asked. Is that where the subjects know they're being observed? Patricia paused, and in that pause, Marcus understood that he had identified the fundamental issue. The night shift observations, the figures he had seen moving across the campus, the sounds he had heard, these were not part of the formal research protocol. These were observations conducted without the subject's knowledge or consent. The night shift observations are a supplementary component of the research, Patricia said carefully. They provide data about subject behavior during periods when the subjects are not explicitly aware that they are being observed. This data is valuable because it documents natural behavior, unmodified by the knowledge of observation. You're conducting observations without consent, Marcus said. That violates the entire ethical framework that you described to David. It supplements the framework, Patricia said, and it is disclosed to the subjects when they conclude their participation.
They understand, when they join the program, that a component of the research will involve periodic observation without explicit awareness. It's part of what they consent to. But not the part they're consciously aware of, Marcus said. Not the part they actively acknowledge. Patricia stood, and she looked at Marcus with an expression that was difficult to categorize. It contained elements of disappointment, but also something that suggested resignation, as if she had anticipated this conversation and had accepted in advance that Marcus would reach this conclusion. "Yes," she said. "That's correct. The night shift observations are conducted without active consent at the moment of observation. But they are disclosed after the fact, and the subjects have the right to request that the data be withheld from the formal research. And importantly, the observations do not involve any kind of intervention or interference with the subject's activities. We observe, but we do not touch, do not manipulate, do not harm." "But you do deceive," Marcus said. "We do," Patricia agreed. "We practice a specific kind of deception, one that we believe is justified by the value of the research that it enables, and by the protocols that we have implemented to protect the subject's welfare and autonomy." Marcus left the dormitory and walked back across the campus. He was alone now. Patricia had remained with David. He walked slowly, processing the conversation, considering what he had learned and what it meant for his continued employment at Westfield Academy. The fundamental tension that he was experiencing was not between belief that the research was harmful and belief that it was benign. It was between two different conceptions of what constituted ethical research practice. Patricia's framework was utilitarian. The research produced valuable knowledge. The subjects received significant compensation. The protocols protected the subject's welfare, and therefore the deceptions practiced were justified. Marcus's intuitive response was deontological. The deceptions violated a fundamental principle about research ethics, regardless of the consequences, and therefore they were not justified. Both frameworks contained internal logic. Both could be defended rationally, and both could not be reconciled with each other. Marcus completed his shift mechanically, moving through the required tasks without engaging in any kind of investigation or scrutiny of the campus's activities. At 6 a.m., he left. He did not return for 3 days. During those 3 days, Marcus sat in his apartment and attempted to determine what he should do. He considered reporting the institution to regulatory authorities, but he recognized that the institution would likely have documentation of voluntary consent that would make such a report difficult to pursue. He considered attempting to document evidence of the observations, but he understood that gathering such evidence would itself constitute a violation of the privacy he was attempting to protect. He considered resigning and walking away, but he recognized that walking away would mean allowing the observations to continue without anyone present who questioned their justification. On the 4th day, he sent an email to Patricia requesting a meeting. When he arrived at the campus that evening, he found Patricia waiting for him in the administrative office. They sat across from each other at her desk, and Marcus laid out what he wanted to propose. "I will continue to work here," Marcus said. "I will perform the duties that I've been hired to perform. But I want to understand the research. I want access to the archive. I want to review the protocols. I want to understand in detail what is being observed and how the observations are being conducted. And I want to know the identities of the subjects and to understand what they have consented to and what they have refused to consent to." Patricia was quiet for a very long time. When she spoke, her voice was measured and thoughtful. "What you're asking for would require clearance," she said. "Security clearance, institutional authorization, and the consent of the Research Ethics Committee. It's not something I can simply grant." "Then I need you to pursue those authorizations," Marcus said, "because otherwise I will resign, and I will attempt to document what I've discovered and present it to whatever regulatory agency oversees educational institutions and research practices." Patricia did not respond immediately. Instead, she stood and walked to a window that looked out onto the darkening campus. When she turned back toward Marcus, her expression had changed. She looked older, and she looked tired. "I will present your request to the Research Ethics Committee," she said. "But I want you to understand what you're asking for.
You're asking to become part of the institution in a deeper way and to move from being an observer of the institution to being a participant in its functioning. That transformation comes with implications that you haven't fully considered. Over the following 2 weeks, Marcus was brought into the institution more fully. He attended meetings with the Research Ethics Committee, reviewed the protocols for subject consent and data protection, examined the physical and psychological assessments that were conducted on the research subjects, and gained access to the archive. What he discovered was both more complex and more defensible than he had initially understood. The research conducted at Westfield Academy was legitimate neuroscience and psychology research. The protocols were detailed and rigorous. The subjects were genuinely informed of what they were consenting to, though the information was presented in a way that somewhat minimized the significance of the night shift observations. The observations themselves were conducted with specific methodologies designed to minimize the risk of harm or violation. And yet, the fundamental ethical concern remained. The research involved observing individuals without their active awareness or consent, regardless of the protocols that were implemented to minimize potential harm, and regardless of the disclosures that occurred after the fact. Marcus completed his full review of the institution and its practices by early January, and when he had completed that review, he made a decision. He returned to the administrative office and requested another meeting with Patricia. "I'm going to continue working here," he said, "and I'm going to recommend that the institution expand the protocols to require explicit consent for night shift observations. Not just disclosure after the fact, but actual active consent obtained before the observations occur." Patricia did not appear surprised by this recommendation. Instead, she nodded slowly, as if she had anticipated that Marcus would reach this conclusion. "The Research Ethics Committee will not approve that recommendation," she said. "Night shift observation without explicit active consent is essential to the research. If we required explicit consent, the subjects would modify their behavior and the data would become less valuable." "Then the research should be modified," Marcus said. "Or the institution should accept that it cannot conduct research that involves unaware observation, no matter how justified it might be by the research's value." "And if the institution refuses to accept that limitation?" Patricia asked. "Then I will resign," Marcus said, "and I will document what I've learned and present it to whatever authority seems appropriate." Patricia stood and walked to her desk. She opened a drawer and removed a folder. She handed it to Marcus. "This is a copy of Robert's recommendation to the institution," she said. "Made approximately 6 weeks before he resigned. It is nearly identical to your recommendation." Marcus opened the folder and read Robert's statement, dated approximately 4 months earlier. The statement outlined the same ethical concerns that Marcus had articulated, made the same recommendation for explicit consent protocols, and expressed the same conclusion that if the institution did not accept the recommendation, Robert would resign and report the institution to external authorities. At the bottom of the statement was a handwritten note, also in Robert's handwriting. "I will give the institution 30 days to respond to this recommendation. If the response is inadequate, I will follow through on my threat." "What happened?" Marcus asked. "Why did Robert leave after 4 months instead of following through on his threat?" "Robert received a response from the institution," Patricia said. The response indicated that the institution would not modify its protocols. Robert, facing the reality of that refusal, was unable to follow through on his threat. He understood that reporting the institution would create a legal and financial situation that he was not prepared to engage with. So he resigned and left. Marcus looked at Patricia, and he understood what she was not saying directly. She was telling him that he was in the same position that Robert had been in. He could make a recommendation, and that recommendation would be refused. And then he would face a choice: follow through on his threat to report the institution to external authorities, or accept the institution's refusal and continue working within the constraints imposed by that reality. "What will happen if I report the institution?" Marcus asked. "The institution will use its resources to defend itself," Patricia said. "It will present its protocols to regulatory agencies and to courts. It will document the subject's consent. It will demonstrate that the research has been conducted according to established ethical guidelines. and it will likely survive the inquiry, because the ethics of the research, while debatable, are not clearly unethical under current legal and regulatory frameworks.
But you would want to know if someone outside the institution became aware of what you're doing, Marcus said. You would want to manage that disclosure rather than having it occur through external reporting.
Yes, Patricia said, that's correct. If you're going to report the institution anyway, I would prefer that you do so in a way that allows the institution to respond formally and officially rather than in a way that creates a scandal and damages the institution's reputation. Marcus understood in that moment what was happening. He was being offered a choice between two unsatisfying options: continue working within an institution that practiced a form of deception that he found ethically problematic, or report the institution to external authorities knowing that the report would likely have no practical effect beyond damaging the institution's reputation and potentially damaging Marcus himself through a protracted legal engagement. He left the administrative office without providing a response to Patricia's implicit offer. He walked out onto the campus in the early evening darkness, and he sat on one of the benches that lined the main pathway, and he remained there for several hours, thinking about Robert, thinking about the research subjects, thinking about the institution, and thinking about what it meant to be complicit in something that you believed to be ethically problematic but that you were unable to effectively address. At 10 p.m., as he was sitting alone on the bench, he heard a sound. It was one of the sounds he had heard many times during his employment at the campus. A distant vocalizing, difficult to categorize, originating from somewhere in the dormitory section of campus. It was the sound of a research subject moving through the campus during night hours, unaware that they were being observed, unaware that Marcus was present and listening, unaware that their behavior was being recorded and analyzed. Marcus stood and walked back toward the administrative office. He entered the office and sat at the desk. He composed an email to the Research Ethics Committee formally documenting his recommendation for explicit consent protocols for night shift observations, and he submitted the email at 11:47 p.m., nearly exactly 24 hours after the precise time that he had first been offered the position at Westfield Academy. He then composed a second email to Patricia, requesting that he be allowed to continue in his position while the Ethics Committee considered his recommendation. Patricia's response came within minutes. Your continuation in your position is approved pending the committee's review. The committee will likely schedule a review meeting within the next 2 weeks. Marcus continued working at Westfield Academy through the winter and into the spring. He performed his duties, monitored the campus during night hours, documented his observations according to protocol, and waited for the Ethics Committee to respond to his recommendation. In early March, he received notice that a formal review hearing would be scheduled for late April. Marcus prepared a detailed presentation, outlining his ethical concerns, providing evidence from published literature on research ethics, and proposing specific modifications to the institution's protocols that would address the concerns while still allowing the research to proceed. The hearing was conducted in a formal conference room at the institution. The Ethics Committee consisted of 5 members: a research director, a lawyer specializing in research regulation, a psychologist, an ethicist, and a community representative. Patricia was present, along with several researchers associated with the institution. Marcus presented his case for approximately 90 minutes, explaining his position, answering questions, and attempting to make the case that the institution's protocols, while sophisticated, still violated fundamental principles of research ethics. When the presentation concluded, the committee excused him from the room and conducted a private discussion. 30 minutes later, they invited him back, and the research director delivered their decision. The committee has considered your recommendation carefully, the director said. We acknowledge that your concerns reflect legitimate ethical considerations. However, the committee has determined that the current protocols are sufficient to address the ethical concerns related to night shift observation. We have therefore decided to maintain the current protocols while implementing several additional safeguards, including enhanced documentation of informed consent and the requirement that subjects be informed of night shift observation within 48 hours of such observation occurring. Marcus heard the decision without surprise. He had anticipated that the committee would find a way to justify maintaining the current protocols, and the enhancements they had described were largely cosmetic changes that did nothing to address the fundamental ethical issue. He stood and excused himself from the meeting. He walked out of the conference room, out of the administrative office, and across the campus in the spring afternoon light. He walked to his car, drove away from Westfield Academy, and returned to his apartment. He wrote a letter of resignation, effective immediately, and submitted it electronically. He then contacted a journalist who had written previously about ethical concerns in psychological research, and he provided her with copies of the institution's protocols, the Research Ethics Committee's decision, and his own analysis of the ethical concerns. The resulting article, published approximately 3 weeks later in a regional publication, described Westfield Academy's research practices and raised questions about the ethical permissibility of conducting observations without explicit active consent. The article prompted an investigation by the state's education department, which ultimately concluded that the institution's practices, while ethically questionable, did not violate any current legal regulations governing research. Westfield Academy adjusted its protocols slightly in response to the investigation, but the fundamental practices remained unchanged. Night shift observations continued, with the only substantive change being that subjects were now informed of such observations within 48 hours, rather than being informed months later when their research participation concluded. Marcus never heard from Patricia or from any other representative of Westfield Academy again. What he learned, through the process of attempting to address the ethical concerns he had identified, was that institutions are powerful and resilient structures. They can absorb criticism, adapt their practices to address external pressure, and continue functioning even when the ethical frameworks that guide them are questioned by individuals both within and outside the institution. And he learned that attempting to change an institution from within is often an exercise in futility, particularly when the institution has resources to defend itself and when there are no legal prohibitions against the practices being questioned. What he did not learn, despite the time he spent at Westfield Academy, was whether the night shift observations were ultimately harmful to the research subjects, or whether they represented a justifiable expansion of existing research protocols in service of the institution's research goals. That question remained, at the end of everything, unanswered. And perhaps that was the true point of the rules that had governed his employment at Westfield Academy. The rules were not designed to prevent Marcus from discovering what was happening at the institution. They were designed to ensure that anyone who discovered what was happening would understand, through the process of discovery and investigation, that the institution's practices existed in a kind of ethical limbo, not clearly illegal, not clearly unethical, but persistently troubling to anyone forced to genuinely confront them. The rules were designed to ensure that anyone employed by the institution would ultimately face a choice: accept the institution's ethical framework and remain complicit in its practices, or reject the framework and leave, having accomplished nothing beyond their own departure. Marcus had chosen to leave, and in leaving, he had become part of a pattern that had begun with Robert, and that would likely continue into the future. Individuals hired to manage the institution's night shift operations, discovering the institution's unconventional practices, attempting to address those practices, and ultimately departing, replaced by the next individual who would undertake the same journey and reach the same impasse. The rules for cleaning the school campus after dark had never been about cleaning at all. They had always been about silence, about the maintenance of an institution that could not function if what it did became widely known, and about the selection and management of individuals who could be trusted to observe the institution's activities without being able to effectively change them. And perhaps somewhere at Westfield Academy, new rules were being written for the next night shift manager, rules that would be presented as straightforward and safety-related, but that would conceal layers of complexity and ethical ambiguity beneath their simple surface. Because institutions endure, and they require keepers, and they select those keepers with the understanding that the keepers will ultimately leave, replaced by others who will undertake the same futile journey of discovery and attempted reform.